The Monomaniac, from the novel Stalinland, written and read by John Loranger. Once upon a time, there lived a young man named Sergei. He lived in the warm, dry climate of a foreign country far to the southwest of Stalinland. The city where he lived was large and bustling and, as I said, warm and dry. In short, it was a climate conducive to the proliferation of spiders. And though it is true that Stalinland has its fair share of spiders, the coldness of our climate limits the time they are active. Not so in the place where Sergei lived. My hero was comparable to other young men in most respects. He was not too handsome, but not bad-looking either. His intelligence was above average, and his teachers had always liked him. His parents, too, were fond of him, even though they always suspected there was something different about him, something that set him apart from others, not necessarily in a good way. But all in all, they felt good about their boy, and the values they instilled as he grew up could be summed up as follows. Education, not too much or too little, work, marriage, kids, death. That's all this life is about. Although religion was of marginal concern to Sergei's parents, the family did attend church. It was a matter of just in case there's an afterlife. But during the church services, Sergei actually listened to the readings. He was not sure what to make of the things he heard, but the words trickled their way into his heart. Where all this was leading, he could not have guessed, not in a million years. He had friends, competed in sports, and experienced the joys and heartaches of a romantic relationship or two. It may or may not be a significant fact that he had always been sensitive to beauty, which inclined him to read and write poetry. In my opinion, the poetry he composed was not half bad, and might have been published in a local newspaper or a school magazine if he'd taken the trouble to submit anything. For example, minnows in the water scatter from my harmless shadow, while blue damselflies, making love mid-air, heed me not. Or, oh, these distances, abysses of time and space, that perpetually separate would-be lovers. Or this strikingly mystical specimen, you make of me, O you who are, a heaven for you. Let this alone, be for me eternity. Alas, Sergei did not want to be a poet or a mystic, nor a lover, or an athlete, or a worker, husband, father, corpse. What he really wanted was world destruction. It was something he had dreamed about, asleep and awake, since childhood. In his mind's eye, but looking on safely from afar, he could see whole cities reduced to rubble and ruins, flame and smoke. He saw its citizens scurrying in terrified and maddened swarms, organized here and chaotic there, devouring and being devoured. He could hear, as if from the blackened maw of hell's entrance, a profound mingling of male and female howls. And yet, hardly horrified or saddened, these apocalyptic spectacles infused in him a sense of moral satisfaction. The origin of the visions had always been a mystery, and he spoke of them to no one. Then one morning, while still in bed, he saw a small spider on the ceiling right above where he lay. It froze him with fear as he realized that the spider might release its hold on the ceiling at any moment and descend toward him on an invisible strand of silk. He'd seen this sort of thing before, and it always made his skin crawl. When it happened now, he was too paralyzed to move out of the way, and the spider, forelegs outstretched, landed on the tip of his nose. No, it did not bite him, and even if it had, no harm would have resulted. As is well known, most spiders are harmless to humans. This individual, a jumping spider, was no exception. Members of this family are regarded as the most feline or cutest spiders in existence. True, some jumping spiders might deliver a slightly painful bite, but they are not hazardous to people. Not that any of this mattered to Sergei. He hated spiders as such, and now it dawned on him that they were the reason he wished to see the world destroyed. Everything was good, everything was beautiful, and life was paradise, if not for spiders. Moreover, they were the reason he set fire to his bedroom that morning. He was a young adult at the time, 21 years old. Fortunately, before the house burned, the fire department arrived and extinguished the blaze. Sergei told everyone the fire started accidentally as a result of smoking in bed. I dozed off, he explained apologetically. It won't happen again. When he said this, his mother and father glanced at one another, and though they did not reveal to the officials what they knew, namely, that their son did not smoke, that he was lying, they did suggest to Sergei only a day or two after the incident that he move out of their home. It was high time he did so anyway. "You're an adult now," said his father. "You shouldn't stay tied to your mother's apron strings forever, you know." And so, with little more than the clothes he had on, he left the home of his parents. He kept the job he already had, bussing tables and washing dishes at an ice cream shop, and moved into a rooming house within easy walking distance. The room he now occupied was not merely as small as a closet, it was a closet, 8 feet long and 5 feet wide, but a closet nonetheless. Sergei did not mind. All he required was an affordable place to sleep, and the empty closet in the rooming house suited this purpose. He discovered that he enjoyed being out on his own. Not until he left home did he realize how stifling his life with his parents had been. But unlike many young people, he did not blame his mother and father for any problems he might have. Sergei blamed only spiders. In fact, he blamed spiders for every misery in existence, be it stubbed toes or world wars, hangnails, or death itself. The majority of his free time was spent at the local library, where he perused everything he could find about the enemy, from propaganda geared toward children to thick, hard-headed scientific tomes. The extensive notes he took were scribbled with a jittery, overly caffeinated hand and filled, front and back, 300 sheets of paper. As he worked, sweat dripped from the tip of his nose, and he experienced the intoxication that stimulates efforts directed toward forbidden or exceptionally difficult goals. It seemed to him that he would be the herald of something new, something irrefutably right and true, and its impact on the world would be transformative down to the last atom. It was a kind of secret knowledge to which he alone was privy, at least for the time being. Eventually, in the fullness of time, the things he knew would be revealed like the light of a new and purifying sun to all mankind. At closing time, it often happened that he had to be driven from the building by the elderly but plucky librarian. Sometimes he eluded her and remained inside all night, reading or writing by the glow of exterior light sources through a window. The days and months passed, and his personal hygiene worsened. But that was a trifling concern. Sergei realized he was approaching a comprehensive knowledge of his subject, comprehensive in the sense of knowing it as perfectly as it can be known, a form of knowledge normally attributed to God alone. True, unlike run-of-the-mill scientists, he avoided any direct observation of arachnids. Even chance encounters which still occurred threw him into fits of disgust. Thus it could be said that Sergei was a desk-bound expert. But what he lacked insofar as direct observation is concerned, he made up for by way of spiritual understanding. He understood the essence of spiders. One day when he arrived at work, his boss fired him. "Why?" Sergei asked. "Because you stink and you look like a werewolf," his boss answered. "I've told you more than once to clean up, but you refuse." "I don't have time to bathe," he protested. "Well, now you will," said his boss. "See Polina about your final paycheck and then get out." Afterward, Sergei walked to a park and sat on a grassy slope. He lay back after a while, looking at the blue sky. Lovers strolled past and children frolicked in the playground nearby, but he did not notice anyone around him. There he remained for the rest of the day and into the night, long after everyone else had left. Gazing at the stars, he yearned to be where they are, away from this spider-polluted earth. As the night passed, so did his depression. He realized that the loss of his job was auspicious. The time had come to share with others the knowledge he possessed. The next day, at the same park, after crowds accumulated, Sergei stood atop a bench near the children's playground and began to shout, "Spiders! Spiders! Spiders! Dear people, how can you endure them?" But the message that followed did not matter to anyone. All that registered was the sheer guttural force of Sergei's voice and his dirty, unkempt appearance. Children cried and their mothers seethed. The latter gathered around the rabble-rouser and abused him both verbally and physically. When he attempted to go on with his speech, the gang of mothers took hold of him and tried to forcibly remove him from the playground. A policeman who noticed the disturbance while passing on his motorcycle turned around and stopped to investigate. The mothers told him that this stranger, whom they described as a dangerous fanatic, had frightened their children with his ranting. Listening to their version of the story, the officer nodded sympathetically. It was obvious from the start that Sergei did not stand a chance in the face of such bias, and in the end he was warned by the officer to go away or face jail time. Glowering at them as if they were spiders, Sergei said, "I will annihilate you all," and turned to leave. Undeterred, he boarded a city bus and left it to chance to transport him where he was meant to go. The bus itself was crowded, so he stood up and began his sermon afresh, using the same words as before. The driver and several passengers told him to be quiet, but their objections could not silence him. Midway between stops, the bus came to a halt and Sergei was ejected onto the pavement. Still on all fours as the bus pulled away, he noticed that he was next to the university. "These people," he said to himself, "will understand me. They would not be in this place if they were not seekers of knowledge." Rising to his feet, he strode into the campus, gazing in wonder at the marvelous architecture, statuary, and foliage. The heart of the campus was a court or quad, surrounded by several brick buildings. Students, both male and female, sat everywhere, on benches, stair steps, or the rims of planters within which flowers and trees grew. The young people were reading or writing or conversing and paid no attention to Sergei until he stood on the rim of a particularly high planter and roared with all his might, "Spiders! Spiders! Spiders! Dear people, how can you endure them?" The students turned to look. "You," Sergei said, pointing an accusatory finger, and you! You recognize their hideousness, you shudder or shriek at the sight of them, and yet you tolerate or ignore their presence in the world. You go about your lives as if all were well, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace." Faces reddened or smiled uncomfortably, eyes rolled, and the inevitable hecklers spoke up. Shut up. Yeah, shut up, damn crackpot. Go get your head examined, creep." Still, amid laughter and boos, Sergei continued his speech. "Don't you realize you have been disinherited?" he yelled in a voice hoarse with anguish, clenching his fists and lifting his eyes skyward. "The earth is not yours. It belongs to the spider. Yes, the spider," he screamed, stomping a foot against the flat rim of the planter. "His numbers are legion, and his presence is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous, I say. That means, for those of you who are semi-literate, that no matter where you walk or stand or sit or sleep, a spider is on the move or lurking nearby. He might be large or he might be small, but he is there. And there and there." The thrust of his finger directed everyone's attention to various points in the area where spiders might be. "Look toward heaven and number the stars if you can. Then toward earth and number the spiders if you can. And verily I say unto thee," he said in a voice charged with foreboding, "by them all the nations of the earth are cursed." He stomped a foot again, repeatedly this time shouting, "Cursed! Cursed! Cursed!" His tone of revulsion was so intense and earnest that many of the students began to listen. "Do you realize that arachnids live on your bodies? They are called demodex, or more simply eyelash mites. Contemplate then Leonardo's Mona Lisa. Upon that illustrious face, microscopic arachnids thrive." Pausing to take a deep breath, he squeezed his eyes shut and shouted, "Ladies and gentlemen, the spider has inherited the earth. This world is his, and unless we take it back, it will remain his forever." By then, his impromptu congregation had been utterly muted, not excluding the hecklers. But the tirade stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. Gazing darkly at the students, Sergei said, "My words fall on deaf ears. Go on, slaves and blind fools. Go live your lives in submission to your eight-legged lords and masters. But remember this. You are not who you think you are. You are not what you think you are." Not even Sergei knew the meaning of this last statement, but its portentous air left an impression on everyone present. He knew that in later years the students would remember this day and this hour, the day and the hour when a wild prophet thrust himself into their midst to shout a truth which they could neither understand nor altogether ignore. With that assurance, he jumped to the pavement below the planter and started away. He walked ahead with his eyes on the ground, not paying attention to where he was going and bumping a few shoulders along the way. At one point, he nearly collided with the trunk of a tree. Pausing briefly, he stepped aside and directed a dirty look at the tree. While crossing through a packed parking lot, he walked in the middle of the various avenues and was beeped at by several moving vehicles. Continuing ahead, he finally came to a stop at the edge of a flat rectangular field, the campus's football stadium. No one else was present, not on the field itself, nor on its surrounding track or in the bleachers. A goal was positioned off to his right, and he smiled wistfully at the sight of it, remembering that he used to be a goalkeeper. But the smile vanished as his gaze wandered and focused sharply on the field's green, neatly trimmed lawn. He saw that strands of webs, lit by sunlight, were attached to virtually every blade of grass throughout the field's 100-yard length and 50-yard width. Pondering the shimmering threads, he experienced a sudden, crushing sense of futility. Quoting Jonah, he said aloud, "Take my life from me, O Lord, for it is better for me to die than to live." He would have fallen to his knees, but just then he heard footsteps approaching on the pavement behind him. He wondered if a soccer team was coming to the field to practice, and then he wondered if some students from the quad were coming to beat him up. The latter prospect struck him as entirely agreeable. Turning, he saw a dozen young men coming toward him. Not around a dozen, but exactly 12. 12. They came to a stop. "What do you want?" Sergei asked, with an expression of undisguised contempt. His face snarled and his eyes smoldered. One of the young men broke from the group and came forward. "Sir," he said, in a hat-in-hand tone, "your speech back there, we were floored." For several seconds, Sergei said nothing. Poised as he was for martyrdom, it was a disappointment to realize that the student was in earnest. So too his 11 companions, whose expressions were a mix of wide-eyed eagerness, shyness, and awe. "We want to learn more," the spokesman said. "Is there someplace we can go?" They drove in 3 separate vehicles to Sergei's rooming house. With 13 people inside it, the closet was cramped, and Sergei's body odor was especially conspicuous. Harsh lighting was provided by a bulb that hung on a cord about 3 feet below the ceiling. But the significance of the discussion that followed overrode these trifling discomforts. Listening to Sergei, the young men became increasingly convinced that they were in the presence of a genius. His eyes, bloodshot with insomnia and wild with rage, had a hypnotic effect on them all. That he was mad, they did not doubt, but his was a special kind of madness. Its defiance of logic and reason struck them as an expression of some higher truth. Had he told them that 2 + 2 = 0, or that the part is always greater than the whole, or that good is evil and evil is good, they would have believed him. Had he said that crimes must be committed, these 12 young men were prepared to commit crimes. In fact, they expected as much. They hoped for it. How else can you bring about meaningful change, each one asked himself, if heads do not roll, if blood does not flow? Messianic yearnings flooded their hearts with a sense of optimism, the likes of which they had never before experienced. A new world or social order seemed at hand, and they would be its founding fathers. They looked ahead, far into the future, when gigantic copper statues or figures in wax museums would recall their greatness to the minds of coming generations. A chant erupted spontaneously and climactically from within the closet. "Make way for paradise! Make way for paradise!" It continued until several tenants complained. Subsequent meetings took place at the 2-story home of one of the students, a wealthy fellow named Naphtali. He had inherited the house from an uncle and lived there alone. Sergei pointed out that it was extravagant and selfish not to share such a dwelling rent-free with a worthy person. Naphtali agreed, and Sergei moved in at once. In this more comfortable setting, the discussions that arose were less one-sided than before. In fact, they were not really discussions, but fervent arguments. Hands slapped the dining room table, and thrown bottles broke against the walls. The young men shouted at each other and shoved and spat at each other. The conflicts were divided between 3 camps, each of which argued for a different program of action. The first camp wanted to exterminate only spiders that are dangerous to humans, black widows, for example, or the funnel web spider of Australia. The second camp agreed that the dangerous spiders should be exterminated as quickly as possible, but they called for the destruction of other spiders as well, if only at a gradual rate. The third camp, headed by Sergei, demanded the wholesale and immediate extermination of all spiders, including their relatives, scorpions, ticks, and the like. The moderates, especially among the first camp, thought this foolish. "It's not only unrealistic," their spokesman, Leon, said, "it's immoral." "What?" voices roared in unison. "It is unrealistic," Leon explained, leaning over the table and wagging a forefinger, "because it's simply impossible to kill every arachnid on the planet. It is immoral because, well, despite their hatefulness, the beneficial effects of spiders cannot be denied." Outrage over these statements was so intense that one man began tearing out clumps of his own hair. Another covered his ears and screamed. A third had to be restrained from committing suicide with a straight-edge razor. "Think about it," Leon pled. "Spiders prey upon insects that destroy crops and upon disease-spreading flies and mosquitoes. This is not opinion, but scientific fact. If the entire arachnid population were to disappear from the earth, human life, in fact all life, would be adversely affected, perhaps imperiled." Such arguments deeply offended most of Sergei's followers, but Leon refused to yield. "And what about eyelash mites?" he demanded, banging a fist against the table. "How do you kill off those? Do you intend to exterminate their hosts, that is, the entire human population, including yourselves?" This objection seemed to stump everyone in the second and third camps. Silence filled the room, and all faces turned to their leader for guidance. Although tempted to lunge forward and drink every drop of Leon's blood, Sergei restrained himself. "Everyone go home for now," he said with studied calm. "Take some time to think about what we have discussed. We shall meet again 1 week from tonight." So the present meeting was brought to a close, and the young men went their separate ways. But another meeting was secretly convened the following night, and only members of the second and third camps were invited. Sergei began the proceedings. "Gentlemen, it has become obvious," he said, "that a traitor has infiltrated our circle. If he were alone, that would be bad enough, but he has 3 followers. After a minute, he asked, "Can anyone doubt that these duplicitous scoundrels will expose us to the authorities unless we submit to their policies?" Because this was impossible to doubt, a murder plot was conceived and planned out. It would take place 6 nights hence at the next meeting. Sergei's idea was to trap the members of the first camp inside Naphtali's house and set it on fire. The house's owner was not so much willing as eager to go along with this. Leon tended to treat Naphtali as an intellectual inferior, as did the other members of the first camp. Whenever he spoke, they would nudge each other and smirk, or burst into laughter outright. But to be fair, Naphtali's motives were fundamentally pure. He simply believed in Sergei and did not believe in Leon. The same could be said about the other members of the second and third camps. Most of them, at any rate, for even among them a Judas lurked. His name, by the way, was Judas. He was a reserved fellow, a true lone wolf, and as such he had a deficient sense of camaraderie or civic responsibility. Even though he was ready and willing to murder untold numbers of spiders, he would not do the same to a human, even one as despicable as Leon. So that same night, albeit with a heavy heart, Judas went to the police headquarters and exposed the plot to the authorities. He told them everything, not only that which concerned the murder plot proper, but also Sergei's plan to destroy the Earth's arachnid population. For this information, the police were glad, and promised to give Judas both money and protection. Within just a few days, the, so to speak, crime was thwarted, and the ringleader, Sergei, he alone, was arrested. I agree that this was unfair. I sympathize with your outrage and grief. But when you take into account the imperfection of human justice, and when you consider the full context of history, such an outcome is not so surprising. You might even call it inevitable. So Sergei was charged with attempted murder. The case against him was not airtight, but it didn't help when the prosecution learned that a fire, ignited under suspicious circumstances, had nearly burned down the home of his parents. During the trial, however, Sergei's lawyer argued that his client was obviously insane and should not be held responsible for his actions. No serious attempt was made to refute the argument. One look at Sergei with his shaggy hair and feverish eyes removed all doubt. Consequently, a plea bargain was reached, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in an asylum for the insane. You'll be glad to know that this facility was not such a terrible place. It provided its inmates with 3 meals a day, plus recreation, arts and crafts, visitations, and even an occasional musical performance from local talents. The grounds were beautified with pine trees and palm trees and green lawns, and the cells were more like homey bedrooms than restrictive compartments. Sergei was assigned a cell to himself, one of the advantages of being homicidal. Special restrictions applied in his case, the most notable being that he was not allowed to smoke or to have matches for any reason. This was only to be expected, for you see, his war against spiders was not over. Not yet, at any rate. He had been in the asylum for about a month when he was awakened one morning by a voice. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. The voice was soft and yet clearly audible, an angelic voice. Before opening his eyes, Sergei pictured in his mind a beautiful young woman. A female patient, perhaps? A social worker? A nurse? He sat up in bed about halfway, propping himself up on both elbows and looking around through squinted eyes. No one was in the room with him, and the door was still closed, locked in fact. Tilting back his head to yawn, he noticed something on the ceiling. The sight made him shudder. Directly overhead was a spider. Or have you considered, continued the voice, that during the transfiguration of Jesus, his face did shine as the sun? So it is written in Matthew 17, verse 2. Sergei realized with intensified horror that the voice belonged to the spider, a jumping spider. However, frightened as he was not overly surprised. Deep down, he had always suspected that spiders could think and speak and read. These were sinister realities he had tried, if only unconsciously, to keep in the dark. But the light was upon him now, and it was impossible to hold it at bay. Don't be afraid, the spider said. I promise to stay up here until you are ready. Ready for what? Sergei asked with a quavering voice. What do you want? For you to realize, explained the spider, that I am not excluded from those things which the Creator sees as very good. Furthermore, it added, creeping along the ceiling with short, jerky movements, now backward, now forward, and sometimes sideways, if Jesus was human in all things except sin, then the microscopic mites that inhabited his face, as they inhabit the faces of all humans, must have participated in his glorious transfiguration. Again, I refer you to Matthew 17:2. The implications of this, the spider remarked while wheeling about suddenly on its axis, are staggering. Sergei's knowledge of the Bible was good, but not thorough. He remembered that God was as pleased as was Sergei himself by the various products of creation, the sun, moon, stars, and so forth, but he, that is Sergei, did not remember the particular passage from Genesis which the spider quoted, nor did he remember Matthew 17:2. Not that he accepted the inferences the spider drew from these verses, assuming they existed in the first place. That same day, hoping to refute his tempter, Sergei asked for a Bible, and one was brought to him by the asylum's chaplain. When this gentleman did not depart at once, he was shoved without ceremony into the hall. He had been hoping to draw Sergei into a theological discussion, and delivering a Bible seemed like a handy pretext, but it didn't work. Shortly afterward, a pair of onlookers observed a strange event through the opening on Sergei's door. They saw the inmate addressing a small spider, as if engaged in some sort of debate. The onlookers were the head doctor and the chaplain, and, as you might expect, they could hear only one side of the exchange. The peculiar dialogue lasted for hours and frequently grew heated, at least from Sergei's side. He would shout at the spider or flip frantically through the pages of his Bible, grumbling, "It's not possible it says that, or if it does, you're misinterpreting." But after a while, Sergei showed signs of yielding. He was heard to say, "You make a good point, and also, I guess I never thought about it that way. He even said, "How could I have been so stupid?" Finally, in an attitude of contrition and surrender, he knelt next to his bed and cried out, "Depart from me, O Lord, for I am a sinful man." At this point, the spider descended from the ceiling, forelegs outstretched, and landed with feathery lightness on the penitent's clasped hands. Far from being repulsed, Sergei smiled at the compact and energetic arachnid, staring closely at its glossy black eyes and twitching mouth parts. His face glowed and his eyes shed tears. Soon it was clear to every lucid or half-lucid observer in the asylum that Sergei had undergone a profound change. Perhaps he was still mad, but he was no longer prone to pyromania or violence of any sort. His kindness toward all creatures, human and otherwise, was phenomenal. He would embrace and comfort troubled inmates, even the most dangerous, and would rather die than swat a mosquito or kill a bedbug. He attended all the church services and continued to read the Bible, sometimes to himself or sometimes to others. At times he was seen reading the scriptures to birds or squirrels or to trails of ants. When laughed at for doing so, he seemed glad to admit that he was an idiot. If told to bathe, he bathed. If told to eat, he ate, but he had to be told. At night, from the window of his darkened cell, he gazed at the sparkling stars in the sky. For Sergei, however, the stars were not stars per se. What he saw was something much greater, more glorious, and very much alive. Sergei saw unnumbered swarms of transfigured spiders.